The Wyoming winter of 1885 arrived with particular vengeance. Local folks would later call it the winter that broke both bank and spirit. Snow had fallen without mercy for 3 days straight, burying the small homestead of Jack Thornton under a blanket of white so thick it threatened to swallow the entire structure whole. Inside the crude log cabin, Jack paced across worn floorboards, his broad shoulders hunched with exhaustion. A small bundle wailed in his arms, the tiny cries growing weaker with each passing hour. Margaret Thornton, Maggie as Jack called her, was just 2 weeks old and slowly starving to death. Jack had tried everything: goat's milk diluted with water, cow's milk sweetened with precious sugar, even a mixture of crushed biscuit in warm water that Martha Wilson from town had sworn would sustain the child. Nothing worked. The infant turned her head away from each offering, her small face growing more gaunt, her cries more feeble as the hours passed. Night had fallen hours ago, and the storm outside matched the tempest in Jack's heart. 38 years old with hands calloused from a life of hard labor, Jack had faced down rustlers, survived drought, even killed men during his younger days as a hired gun in Kansas. But nothing had prepared him for this particular brand of helplessness. "Just a little more," Jack whispered, his voice rough from disuse. "Just a little longer, Maggie." Jack wasn't a man given to prayer. Not anymore. But in that moment, he found himself bargaining with whatever God might be listening. Take me instead. Just let her live. The cabin walls creaked under the assault of the wind. Jack's gaze drifted to the Winchester Model 1873, propped beside the door, its presence a comfort in the uncertain world of the frontier. A good rifle meant survival out here, especially for a man alone. The thought caught in his throat. A man alone with an infant who needed something he could not provide. Lightning illuminated the cabin interior in harsh white flashes, revealing the sparse furnishings Jack and Elizabeth had acquired during their 3 years of marriage. The hand-carved rocking chair Elizabeth had loved. The small shelf of books she'd insisted on bringing west. The trunk containing her belongings that Jack hadn't yet found the courage to open. 2 years ago, Jack had hung up his guns and reputation as Deadeye Thornton to marry Elizabeth and start anew in Wyoming territory. The past buried, a future promised. Now Elizabeth lay in a snow-covered grave behind the cabin, and their daughter faded with each passing moment. The locals believed Elizabeth had died from childbed fever. Only Jack knew the truth, a secret that burned inside him like acid. She'd taken laudanum, a full bottle of it, 3 days after Maggie's birth. Jack had found her still warm, a note clutched in her pale fingers. "I'm sorry, Jack. The darkness won't leave me. Please forgive me. Please tell our daughter her mother loved her, but wasn't strong enough to stay." Jack had buried the empty bottle and the note along with his wife, telling everyone that her heart had simply given out. Suicide was a sin according to the local preacher, and Jack couldn't bear the thought of Elizabeth being denied a proper Christian burial. Couldn't stand the idea of whispers following Maggie as she grew. If she grew, the baby's crying subsided into a whimper, then stopped altogether. Panic surged through Jack's body as he looked down, relaxing only when he saw her tiny chest still rising and falling, her eyes closed in exhausted sleep rather than something more permanent. He moved to the window, pulling back the rough burlap curtain to stare into the swirling white abyss. The storm showed no signs of relenting, the path to town completely impassable. Even if he could make the 25-mile journey, what help awaited there? Doc Sullivan with his whiskey breath and trembling hands. Martha Wilson with her well-meaning but useless remedies. What Maggie needed was a mother. What she needed was Elizabeth. A sound cut through the howling wind, so unexpected that at first Jack thought he'd imagined it. Then it came again, faint but unmistakable. Someone was knocking at his door. Jack laid Maggie in her crude wooden cradle, his movements gentle despite the urgency he felt. His hand found the Winchester by the door, checking the action with practiced efficiency. Visitors during a storm like this were rare. Visitors with good intentions, even rarer. "Who's there?" Jack called, positioning himself with the rifle at the ready. No answer came but another knock, weaker this time. Jack drew back the wooden bar securing the door and pulled it open a crack, the rifle barrel visible and ready. Wind and snow assaulted him immediately, momentarily blinding him. When his vision cleared, he found himself staring at a young woman, her form nearly lost in the darkness and swirling white. She stood slightly hunched, dark hair plastered to a face that might once have been pretty, before exhaustion and fear had carved their marks into it. Her clothes, though of good quality, were soaked through and muddied. But it was not her face that captured Jack's immediate attention. It was the obvious wetness spreading across the front of her dress, darkening the already sodden fabric. Milk! Jack stared at the woman with the practiced assessment of a man who had survived by reading people accurately. She was young, perhaps 26, and her condition was impossible to mistake for anyone who knew anything about new mothers. Yet she stood alone in his doorway, without bundle or basket, without blanket-wrapped baby or any sign of the child her body clearly anticipated feeding. Their eyes met in a moment of mutual recognition. The woman saw Jack's desperation before he could mask it, saw the dying infant in the cradle behind him. She understood in an instant why the stranger looked at her with such naked need written across his weathered face. For his part, Jack recognized the terror barely concealed beneath her exhaustion. He saw the way she glanced over her shoulder into the storm, as if something far worse than weather pursued her through the night. Behind him, Maggie stirred and gave a weak cry. Something shifted in the woman's expression at that sound, some maternal instinct that transcended fear and self-preservation. Without waiting for invitation, she stepped across the threshold, water pooling immediately at her feet as she moved toward the cradle with the inevitability of a river finding its course to the sea. Jack should have stopped her, should have demanded explanation and credentials, should have protected his daughter from this stranger who appeared from nowhere, carrying obvious secrets in her haunted eyes and milk in her breasts, but no child of her own to show for it. Instead, he stepped aside and let fate enter his home. The woman reached the cradle and looked down at the baby. Her expression transformed into something Jack couldn't quite name, something between anguish and longing and fierce protectiveness that ignited in her eyes as she gazed at his dying daughter. She looked back at Jack, and he saw the question forming before she spoke it aloud. "Your child needs feeding," she said, her voice hoarse from exposure to the elements. "Would you permit me?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither fully acknowledged in that desperate moment. Jack felt his throat tighten with emotions he couldn't name. Gratitude and suspicion and hope and fear all tangled together in his chest. He managed a single nod, unable to trust his voice. The woman lifted Maggie from the cradle with a tenderness that made Jack's heart ache. She moved to the rocking chair by the dying fire and began to unfasten her sodden dress with fingers that shook from cold and exhaustion. Jack turned away sharply, granting privacy to this most intimate of acts. He busied himself adding wood to the fire, acutely aware of every small sound behind him, the rustle of fabric, the catch in the woman's breathing. Then the sudden silence as Maggie latched with desperate strength. When he dared to glance back, he saw tears streaming down the stranger's face as she held his daughter. Her expression was one of such profound sorrow mixed with something like peace that Jack felt like an intruder witnessing something sacred and private. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice rough. The woman nodded without looking up, her attention focused entirely on the infant at her breast. "She's very hungry," she whispered. "She hasn't kept anything down for days. She will survive now," the woman said with quiet certainty. "She's strong." Jack sank into a chair across from them, the relief so intense it left him lightheaded. Only then did he notice the woman was shivering violently despite the fire. He rose and fetched a blanket, draping it awkwardly around her shoulders, careful not to disturb the feeding baby. "You're frozen through. I'll make coffee." The woman nodded again, the simple gesture somehow conveying immense gratitude. As Jack busied himself with the coffee pot, she finally spoke again. "My name is Sarah Colton." Jack paused in his task, weighing the social niceties against the bizarre circumstances. "Jack Thornton. The little one is Margaret. Maggie." "Hello, Maggie," Sarah whispered to the nursing infant. "You have your father's chin." They fell into silence again, the only sounds the crackling fire and the occasional contented noises from the baby. Jack brought coffee in a chip mug, setting it within Sarah's reach. "Where's your child?" he finally asked, the question that had been foremost in his mind since seeing her at his door. Sarah's face crumpled, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Gone," she whispered. "My son was born sleeping 3 weeks ago." Jack recognized the euphemism. Stillborn. Understanding dawned, followed by confusion. "But your milk." "A woman's body doesn't know right away," she explained, her voice hollow. "It prepares anyway, expecting a living child to feed." Jack nodded, accepting her explanation, though it seemed incomplete. There was more to her story. There had to be. But the essential truth was evident in the way she cared for Maggie, in the relief on her face as the infant fed. "The storm's bad," Jack said instead. "You can stay until it passes." "Thank you," Sarah replied, meeting his eyes briefly before looking back down at Maggie. "She's falling asleep." Sure enough, the baby had drifted off, milk dribbling from the corner of her tiny mouth. For the first time in days, her face appeared peaceful, rather than pinched with hunger. "She has a proper cradle in the bedroom," Jack said. "I've been keeping her out here by the fire for warmth." Sarah nodded, her movements practiced and gentle as she adjusted her clothing and stood with the sleeping infant. Jack led her to the small adjoining room where a more carefully crafted cradle stood beside a narrow bed. Elizabeth's handiwork adorned the cradle, embroidered linens she'd spent months preparing before Maggie's arrival. "This was your wife's work," Sarah observed softly, recognizing the care in each stitch. "Yes." Jack's voice was flat, brooking no further questions on the subject. "You can have the bed. I'll sleep by the fire." Sarah didn't argue, her exhaustion evident in every line of her body. She placed Maggie in the cradle with practiced ease, tucking the blankets around her tiny form. "She'll wake to feed again in a few hours. I'll bring her to you." Sarah nodded, already swaying slightly on her feet from fatigue. Jack retreated, leaving her to whatever privacy could be found in his small home. He settled in his chair by the fire, listening to the storm rage outside and wondering what storm had driven Sarah Colton to his door on this of all nights. He didn't believe in divine intervention, not anymore, but he couldn't deny the timing seemed beyond mere coincidence. Jack awoke to sunlight streaming through the cabin windows. The storm had broken during the night, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. For a moment he was disoriented, wondering why he was in the chair rather than his bed. Then memory returned in a rush. The woman, Sarah. Jack stood quickly, moving to the bedroom doorway with quiet steps. Inside, he found Sarah curled protectively around the cradle she'd pulled next to the bed, one hand resting on Maggie's small chest as if to reassure herself of each breath. Both were deeply asleep, their features softened in repose. Something twisted in Jack's chest at the sight, an emotion he couldn't name. He retreated to the main room and built up the fire, setting coffee to boil. Outside, the world was transformed into a blinding white landscape, snow piled higher than the bottom of his windows. They were well and truly trapped, at least for the next day or two. The thought should have concerned him more than it did. 3 days passed in a strange domesticity neither Jack nor Sarah acknowledged aloud. The snow began to melt just enough to make travel possible, though still difficult. Maggie thrived under Sarah's constant care, feeding regularly, beginning to gain weight, her cries becoming the healthy demands of a normal infant rather than the desperate whimpers of starvation. Sarah revealed little of herself during those 3 days. She spoke of a father who had been a doctor, explaining her knowledge of childcare and medicinal herbs. She mentioned growing up near Denver. But each time Jack's questions edged toward how she came to be alone in a blizzard, or who might be looking for her, Sarah would change the subject or retreat into silence. Jack didn't press. He had his own secrets, after all, and her presence was keeping his daughter alive. That was enough for now. By the 4th morning, Jack knew he could delay no longer. Their supplies were dwindling, particularly coffee and flour. A trip to town was necessary. "I need to ride to Redemption Creek," he told Sarah over breakfast. "We're low on essentials." Sarah looked up sharply, alarm evident in her features before she masked it. "How far is town?" 25 miles. I can make it there and back in a day if I push, but I'd rather not risk it with the snow. Likely I'll stay overnight and return tomorrow." She nodded, her gaze dropping to Maggie in her arms. "We'll be fine." Jack studied her for a long moment. "Sarah, is there someone looking for you?" The direct question hung in the air between them. Sarah's hands tightened almost imperceptibly around Maggie. "Yes," she finally answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone dangerous?" She met his eyes then, and the fear he saw there was answer enough. Jack nodded once, decision made. He crossed to the small trunk at the foot of his bed and withdrew a Colt single-action Army revolver, checking the cylinder with practiced hands. "You know how to use one of these?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "My father taught me, though it's been years." Jack brought the revolver to her along with a box of ammunition. 6 shots, don't waste them. Anyone comes around that isn't me, you fire a warning first. Most troublemakers will turn tail at the sound. If they don't, he let the implication hang. "You'd trust me with your gun? You barely know me." Jack's expression was grim. "I know you've kept my daughter alive when I couldn't. That's enough knowing for now." He spent the next half hour showing Sarah how to operate the Colt, refreshing her memory on loading and handling. Her hands were steadier than he expected, and she displayed a natural aptitude that suggested her father's lessons had been thorough. Jack prepared for the journey with the efficiency of a man accustomed to harsh conditions. Heavy coat, extra socks, jerky, and hardtack in his saddlebags. The Winchester secured in its scabbard. Before leaving, he stood awkwardly by the door, watching Sarah rock Maggie near the fire. "I'll be back tomorrow afternoon at latest. Bar the door after I leave." Sarah nodded, a small smile touching her lips for perhaps the first time since her arrival. "We'll be waiting for you." The path to Redemption Creek was arduous, the snow still deep in places where drifts had formed. Jack pushed his horse as much as he dared, his thoughts never straying far from the woman and child he'd left behind. Would Sarah still be there when he returned? Or would she take advantage of his absence to disappear as mysteriously as she'd arrived? The thought troubled him more than it should have. Redemption Creek came into view by mid-afternoon, smoke rising from chimneys into the clear blue sky. The town had grown in the 6 years since Jack first arrived in the territory. The railroad had reached them 2 years ago, bringing new businesses and inhabitants eager to stake their claim in the expanding West. Jack rode past the newly constructed train station, nodding to the station master who recognized him with a wave. He continued down the main street, taking note of the increased activity. Men unloading supplies at the general store, a group of ranch hands emerging from the larger of the town's 2 saloons. New faces he didn't recognize mingled with the familiar. He tethered his horse outside Wilson's general store, stamping his feet to restore circulation before entering. The warm interior was a welcome relief from the biting cold, smelling of coffee, tobacco, and the various goods that lined the shelves. Martha Wilson looked up from her position behind the counter, surprise registering on her kind, weathered face. "Jack Thornton, wasn't expecting to see you so soon after that storm. How's the little one?" Jack felt a surge of guilt at the concern in Martha's voice. She had been one of the few to offer genuine help after Elizabeth's death, bringing food and sitting with the baby so Jack could dig the grave. "Maggie's doing better," he said, removing his hat. "Much better, in fact." Martha's eyebrows rose. "That concoction worked then?" "I wasn't sure, but my grandmother swore by it." Jack hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Found something that agreed with her, yes. Need to stock up on supplies now." He handed Martha a list, and she busied herself gathering the items. Jack was grateful for her efficiency and lack of further questions. As she worked, the bell over the door jingled, announcing new customers. 2 men entered, their city clothes immediately marking them as outsiders. Expensive wool coats, polished boots unsuitable for the muddy streets. The shorter man removed his hat, revealing thinning hair and spectacles. The taller kept his hat on, his cold eyes scanning the store with the calculated assessment of a predator. Jack felt the hair rise on the back of his neck, an instinct honed through years of watching for trouble. He turned slightly, keeping the men in his peripheral vision while pretending interest in a shelf of canned goods. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Martha greeted them. "Just passing through?" The shorter man offered a practiced smile. "In a manner of speaking, ma'am, we're looking for information regarding a young woman who may have passed this way recently." Jack stilled, his attention now fully on the conversation, though he maintained his casual posture. "We represent a concerned family in Denver," the man continued, producing a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Their daughter, suffering from a nervous condition, fled her home during a period of mental disturbance. They're most anxious to find her." Martha accepted the paper, examining it with a frown. "Poor thing. What would bring her all the way out here in winter?" "She's not thinking clearly, ma'am. Her condition worsened after a recent tragedy, the loss of her infant son at birth." Jack's blood ran cold. It couldn't be coincidence. "The family is offering a substantial reward." The taller man spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the hard edge of authority. $500 for information leading to her safe return. A murmur went through the store at the mention of such a sum. $500 was more than many local ranchers would see in a year. "What's her name?" someone asked from the back of the store. "Sarah Hayes," the shorter man replied, "though she may be using her maiden name, Colton." Jack forced himself to breathe normally, to keep his face impassive as he turned back to the counter. "How much for all this, Martha?" Martha glanced down at the assembled goods. $4.65, Jack. "Want it on your account?" "Please." Jack began gathering the supplies into his arms, eager to leave before he attracted attention. "Mr. Thornton, is it?" The taller man suddenly addressed him. You have a ranch outside town, I understand. Jack turned slowly, his expression carefully neutral. That's right. The man extended a hand. Frank Miller. This is my associate, James Johnson. We're from the Pinkerton Detective Agency, retained by Mr. William Hayes of Denver to locate his wife. Jack accepted the handshake briefly, noting the calluses that suggested Miller was no stranger to weapons despite his city appearance. Don't recall seeing any woman fitting that description, he said evenly. Been snowed in at my place for days now. Miller studied him with cold assessment. Of course, though if you do encounter anyone unusual once you return home, the reward is substantial. Mr. Hayes is a man of considerable means and influence. I'll keep that in mind, Jack replied, gathering the last of his supplies. Good day, gentlemen. Outside, Jack secured his purchases to his saddle with hands that wanted to shake from suppressed tension. His instincts screamed at him to return home immediately to warn Sarah, but doing so would only draw suspicion. Instead, he forced himself to proceed with his original plan, leading his horse toward the livery stable where he would board it overnight. As he walked, the conversations around him seemed focused on the reward and the missing woman. $500 had captured everyone's attention. Thornton! Jack turned to find Sheriff Caleb Monroe approaching, his badge catching the afternoon sun. Monroe was a man in his early 60s, his face weathered by years of frontier law enforcement, and before that, service in the Union Army during the Civil War. Despite his age, he moved with the deliberate confidence of a man not to be underestimated. Sheriff, Jack acknowledged with a nod. Monroe fell into step beside him. Heard you made it through the storm all right. Elizabeth's grave holding up. As well as can be expected, Jack answered, appreciating the direct concern rather than dancing around the subject as most townsfolk did. Good, good. Monroe was silent for a moment before continuing. You hear about the woman those Pinkerton men are looking for? Jack kept his expression carefully neutral. Heard something about it at the store. Shame about her condition. Monroe didn't sound entirely convinced. Husband claims she killed their newborn son in a fit of madness, then fled, offering enough money to turn every head in the territory. Jack's stomach clenched at the accusation. So at odds with the gentle woman who'd cared for his daughter with such tenderness. Sounds like a family tragedy. Indeed. Monroe studied him for a long moment. You planning to stay in town tonight? That was my intention. Too late to start back now. Wise decision. Weather's still unpredictable this time of year. Monroe adjusted his hat. Those Pinkerton men asked specific questions about isolated homesteads where a woman might seek shelter during the storm. I mentioned several, including yours. Jack met the sheriff's gaze, trying to read the intent behind the information. Was it a warning? A test? Appreciate the heads up, he said carefully. Monroe nodded. Just doing my job. Cooper's place has rooms available if you need one for the night. Good evening, Thornton. Jack watched the sheriff walk away, uneasy about the encounter. Monroe was sharper than most gave him credit for, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the older man suspected something. The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. Jack took a room at Cooper's saloon as suggested, but sleep eluded him. His mind raced with questions. Had Sarah really killed her own child? The accusation seemed incompatible with the woman who had saved Maggie's life, whose touch was so gentle and sure with his daughter. But Jack knew better than most that people contained multitudes, that monsters could wear kind faces, that trauma could twist even the gentlest soul. No, his instincts told him Sarah was running from something far worse than her own actions. The fear in her eyes when he'd asked if someone dangerous was looking for her had been too raw, too genuine. By dawn, Jack had made his decision. He settled his bill, collected his horse from the livery, and was on the trail home before most of the town had stirred from sleep. He pushed his mount harder than was wise given the conditions, anxiety growing with each mile. The Pinkerton men had specifically asked about isolated homesteads. They would be checking each one, methodically eliminating possibilities. It was only a matter of time before they reached Jack's property. The sun was high overhead when Jack finally crested the rise overlooking his small valley. The cabin came into view, smoke rising reassuringly from the chimney. Relief flooded through him at this sign of continued occupancy, followed immediately by renewed tension when he spotted unfamiliar tracks in the melting snow leading toward his home. Someone had visited while he was gone. Jack approached cautiously, rifle at the ready, scanning for any sign of danger. The tracks appeared to be from a single rider who had come and gone, As he neared the cabin, the door suddenly opened. Sarah stood in the doorway, the Colt revolver aimed directly at him. Her face was pale but determined, her hands steady on the weapon. Behind her, Jack could hear Maggie's cries. "It's me," he called, raising one hand while keeping his horse controlled with the other. Sarah lowered the gun immediately, relief transforming her features. She stepped back into the cabin as Jack dismounted and secured his horse to the hitching post. "What happened?" he asked as soon as he was inside, taking in her tense posture. "A man came by yesterday afternoon," Sarah explained, returning the Colt to the table where she'd apparently kept it close at hand. "Said he was looking for strays that might have sought shelter during the storm." "What did he look like?" "Older, silver hair, wore a badge." "Sheriff Monroe." Jack's suspicions were confirmed. "What did you tell him?" "That I was your cousin, come to help with the baby after your wife passed." Sarah lifted Maggie from her cradle, soothing the infant with practiced movements. He seemed to accept it, though he looked at me strangely when the baby quieted as soon as I held her. Jack removed his coat, his mind racing. "Sarah, those men in town are Pinkerton agents hired by a William Hayes from Denver. They're offering $500 reward for information about his wife, who they claim killed their newborn son and ran." Sarah went very still, her face draining of what little color it had retained. "What else did they say?" Jack repeated everything he had heard in town, watching as Sarah's expression shifted from fear to grim resignation. "I should leave," she said quietly when he finished. "Tonight. They'll find me eventually, and when they do, you and Maggie will be in danger too." "Is it true?" Jack asked directly. "Did you kill your child?" Sarah's eyes flashed with sudden anger. "No! My son was born dead, just as I told you. The cord was wrapped around his neck in the womb. There was nothing anyone could have done." "Then why would your husband claim otherwise?" Sarah sank into a chair, still cradling Maggie against her chest. "Because William Hayes doesn't accept failure, especially not in things he considers his property. And that's all I was to him. All our child was, property." Jack remained standing, studying her carefully. "Tell me everything." Sarah took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on Maggie rather than Jack. "I married William 3 years ago. He seemed charming, successful. My father had just died, leaving debts I couldn't pay. William offered security, respectability. I thought I was making a practical choice." Her voice grew distant, as if recounting events that had happened to someone else. "It changed gradually. First, he controlled the household, then my acquaintances, then my movements. By the time I realized the kind of man he truly was, I was already pregnant and had nowhere to go." "He hit you?" Jack asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Sometimes, but William preferred subtler methods. Isolation, humiliation, controlling my food, my sleep." Sarah's hands trembled slightly. "When I was 7 months along, he had me confined to a locked room. Said it was for the safety of his heir. He hired a doctor who treated me like breeding stock rather than a patient. The servants were forbidden to speak to me." Jack felt a slow burn of anger building in his chest as she spoke. He had encountered cruel men throughout his life, but there was something particularly despicable about this calculated torment of a dependent wife. When the baby came early, the doctor couldn't save him. He was born blue, already gone. Sarah's voice broke. "William refused to believe it wasn't my fault. He said I'd done it deliberately to spite him, that I'd moved wrong or eaten something harmful. He was already making arrangements to have me committed to an asylum while he took the child for burial." "So you ran?" Sarah nodded, finally meeting Jack's gaze. "I convinced a kitchen maid to help me. I took my son's body and escaped that night. I buried him myself in the forest outside Denver, marked his grave with stones I gathered in the darkness. I've been running ever since, working in kitchens or laundries when I could, moving on whenever I heard rumors of men asking questions. Until the storm forced you to my door." "Yes." Sarah looked down at Maggie, who had fallen asleep against her chest. "I thought perhaps God had finally answered my prayers for death. Instead, he showed me this child who needed what I could give." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Perhaps it was my son's spirit guiding me here." Jack turned away, moving to stoke the fire, giving himself time to process everything he'd heard. Sarah's story rang true, matching the genuine care she'd shown Maggie. The fear that haunted her eyes now had a source he could understand. "What will you do?" Sarah asked quietly from behind him. Jack straightened, decision already made, though he hadn't consciously acknowledged it until that moment. "You're not going anywhere, not tonight. Jack, these men will find me eventually. Hayes has money, influence, and we have a long winter ahead. Jack turned to face her, his expression resolute. Maggie needs you to survive. I need you to help her survive. As for Hayes and his Pinkerton men, let them come. Sarah stared at him, disbelief warring with hope in her expression. You can't mean to harbor a fugitive. They're saying I'm a murderer. I've been called worse in my time. Jack's mouth quirked in a humorless smile. Besides, I've never put much stock in what wealthy men claim about those who've wronged them. Why would you risk yourself and Maggie for a stranger? Jack considered the question, searching for an answer that made sense even to himself. Maybe I'm tired of watching people I care about die. Maybe I believe your story, or maybe I'm just stubborn enough to resist being told what to do by men who have never worked a day of honest labor. He crossed the room to where Sarah sat with Maggie, kneeling so they were at eye level. You saved my daughter when I couldn't. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she nodded, a tentative smile transforming her face into something approaching beauty, despite the exhaustion and fear that had marked it. Outside, snow began to fall again, light flakes dancing in the winter sun. A fresh blanket to cover tracks, Jack thought. A clean slate. For now, they were safe. For now, they had time. But Jack harbored no illusions about the future. William Hayes would not stop looking for his wife. The Pinkerton agents would not abandon a paid contract. Sooner or later, trouble would find them. And when it did, Jack Thornton would be ready. Winter settled over the Wyoming territory like a predator claiming its domain. The land lay dormant beneath a pristine white shroud, temperatures plummeting with each passing week. For most frontier settlers, winter meant survival by preparation and patience, waiting for the thaw while rationing supplies gathered during more forgiving seasons. For Jack Thornton and Sarah Colton, winter offered something unexpected: time. January crept by in a rhythm neither had anticipated. Days blended together in the isolated cabin, marked by Maggie's feeding schedule and the necessary chores of survival. The infant thrived under Sarah's care, her cheeks filling out, her cries growing stronger and more demanding. By the end of the month, she had nearly doubled her weight, her dark eyes tracking movement with growing awareness. Jack found himself watching Sarah as she moved through his home, her presence transforming the crude cabin in ways he couldn't quite articulate. She cooked simple but nourishing meals from their limited stores, sang softly to Maggie during evening feedings, and mended Jack's worn clothing with nimble fingers. The domestic tranquility felt almost like a deception, as if they were actors in a play rather than fugitives awaiting discovery. Sarah rarely ventured outside, her fear of being spotted keeping her within the cabin's walls. Jack handled the outdoor chores, checking trap lines, caring for the livestock in the small barn, and maintaining a vigilant watch for unwelcome visitors. Each time he returned, stamping snow from his boots and bringing the bitter cold in with him, he found Sarah's eyes immediately seeking his face, searching for signs of danger. On a particularly bitter evening in early February, Jack returned to find Sarah seated at the rough-hewn table, Elizabeth's Bible open before her. The sight stopped him momentarily. He hadn't touched the book since his wife's death, couldn't bear to see the passages she'd marked or the notes she'd written in the margins. I hope you don't mind, Sarah said softly, noticing his reaction. I found it while cleaning. Jack shook his head, hanging his coat on a peg by the door. She'd want someone to use it. Sarah closed the Bible gently, her fingers lingering on its worn leather cover. She must have been a woman of deep faith. She was. Jack busied himself with stoking the fire, avoiding Sarah's gaze. The preacher said it was that faith that carried her through the journey west. Not many city women could adapt to this life. And yet something broke her spirit in the end, Sarah observed quietly. Jack stilled, his back to her. Few in town had dared to speak so directly about Elizabeth's death. The acceptable narrative was that she had been too delicate for frontier life, that childbirth had simply been too much for her constitution. No one questioned why a healthy young woman would suddenly succumb to heart failure. Yes, he finally answered, turning to face Sarah. Something did. Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. They had both witnessed the darkness that could consume a person from within. Both carried the weight of being unable to save someone who didn't want to be saved. I found these as well, Sarah said, changing the subject. She placed 3 wildflowers on the table, dried but still retaining their color, hidden between the pages. Jack recognized them immediately. Prairie gentians. They only bloom for a few weeks in late summer. Elizabeth collected them. His voice softened with memory. Said they reminded her that beauty can thrive in harsh conditions. Sarah's lips curved in a small smile. A wise observation. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the crackling fire and Maggie's soft breathing from her cradle. Jack felt something shift in that moment, a subtle realignment in his perception of Sarah. She wasn't simply a mysterious woman who had appeared during a storm, nor just a lifeline that kept his daughter fed. She was becoming something more, someone who could understand the complexities of his grief without demanding explanations or offering hollow consolations. I need to teach you to shoot properly, Jack said abruptly. Sarah looked up, startled by the sudden change in topic. I can handle the Colt. Not well enough, Jack replied, his tone matter-of-fact rather than judgmental. Not if trouble comes calling. You expect it will. It wasn't a question, but Jack answered anyway. Hayes won't give up. Men like him don't accept defeat, especially not from those they consider beneath them. He met her gaze directly. $500 will keep every opportunist in the territory looking for you, and when the Pinkerton men exhaust their methodical approach, Hayes will send others less concerned with the legal niceties. Fear flickered across Sarah's face, but she mastered it quickly. When do we start? The next morning dawned clear and cold, the air so crisp it seemed brittle enough to shatter. Jack led Sarah to a small clearing behind the cabin. Maggie bundled securely against Sarah's chest in a sling Jack had fashioned from an old blanket. We'll start with this Winchester, Jack said, handing her the rifle. More forgiving than the Colt for a beginner, and better range if you need to defend the cabin. Sarah accepted the weapon with appropriate reverence, her movements cautious but not timid. Jack spent nearly an hour explaining the rifle's mechanism, showing her how to load, aim, and care for it. To his surprise, she absorbed his instructions with quick intelligence, asking pertinent questions that revealed her father's rudimentary lessons had provided a solid foundation. Ready to try? He asked, setting up an empty tin can on a fence post 30 yards away. Sarah positioned the rifle against her shoulder as Jack had shown her, drew a steady breath, and squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide, but not by much. Again, Jack instructed, making a small adjustment to her stance. Keep both eyes open. Her second shot clipped the edge of the can, sending it spinning. A smile of genuine pleasure transformed her face, making her look younger, unburdened by the fears that normally shadowed her features. I did it! Good, Jack said, unable to suppress his own small smile at her enthusiasm. Now do it again, 10 more times. They practiced for an hour until Sarah could hit the target consistently. Jack noted with approval that she handled the rifle with increasing confidence, her natural ability becoming evident as she relaxed into the task. In this world, Jack told her as they walked back to the cabin, sometimes the ability to protect yourself is the only thing standing between you and death. Doesn't matter if you're a man or woman. Out here, death doesn't discriminate. Sarah glanced at him, adjusting Maggie in her sling. Is that what you did? Before settling here? Protected people? Jack's expression hardened slightly. No, quite the opposite. He didn't elaborate, and Sarah didn't press. Another unspoken agreement between them. Certain parts of their past remained their own. The shooting lessons continued daily, weather permitting. Sarah progressed rapidly with the Winchester, and Jack eventually moved her to the more challenging Colt revolver. By mid-February, she could draw, aim, and fire with reasonable accuracy, her movements becoming fluid with practice. Your father taught you well, Jack observed one afternoon as they cleaned the weapons by the fire, Maggie sleeping peacefully in her cradle. He believed women should be able to defend themselves, Sarah replied, her hands moving competently over the disassembled Colt. He treated many wives whose husbands used them as convenient targets for their rage. Said if more women knew how to shoot, fewer men would raise their hands in anger. Jack nodded, understanding the sentiment. Smart man. He was. Sarah's voice softened with memory. After my mother died, when I was 12, he raised me alone. Taught me to read medical texts, assist with simple procedures. He wanted me to continue his practice someday, perhaps become a proper doctor if the medical schools ever welcomed women. Her hands stilled on the gun. Then his heart failed 3 years ago, leaving nothing but debts and memories. And Hayes stepped in, Jack said quietly, piecing together her story. Sarah nodded, resuming her work on the weapon. William seemed so different from the men my father warned me about. Cultured, considerate. He admired my education rather than mocking it like other suitors. I thought I'd made a sensible choice. Her mouth twisted in a bitter smile. Perhaps if I'd chosen with my heart instead of my practical mind, I would have seen the truth sooner. Jack considered her words, thinking of his own marriage to Elizabeth. He had chosen with his heart, desperately in love with her refinement, her education, her delicate beauty so different from the harsh world he'd inhabited. Yet that choice had ended in tragedy too. Sometimes there's no right choice, he said finally, just different paths to the same pain. Sarah looked up, meeting his gaze across the table. Something passed between them, a recognition of shared understanding that transcended words. Neither of them had emerged unscathed from their pasts, yet somehow they had found their way to this moment, this cabin, this temporary peace. The moment was broken by the distant sound of approaching hoofbeats. Jack was on his feet instantly, Winchester in hand. Sarah moved with equal speed, scooping Maggie from her cradle and retreating toward the bedroom, the Colt appearing in her free hand as if conjured. "Stay inside," Jack ordered, moving to the window. He peered cautiously through the curtain, muscles tense with readiness. A single rider approached, the familiar silhouette of Sheriff Monroe astride his sturdy bay gelding. Jack exhaled slowly, relaxing his grip on the rifle but not setting it aside. "It's Monroe," he called to Sarah. "Stay back anyway." Jack opened the door as the sheriff reined in before the cabin. Monroe dismounted stiffly, the cold clearly aggravating old wounds that the man never discussed, but that Jack suspected dated back to the war between the states. "Afternoon, Thornton," Monroe greeted, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "Thought I'd check on you folks, being so isolated out here." Jack nodded, maintaining his position in the doorway. "Appreciated, Sheriff, but we're managing fine." Monroe stamped his feet to restore circulation, his shrewd eyes taking in Jack's defensive posture. "Cousin still helping with the little one?" "She is." "Good, good." Monroe glanced toward the barn, then back at the cabin. "Those Pinkerton men are still in town, asking questions, seem particularly interested in homesteads to the north and east." Jack understood the warning for what it was. "We're northwest." "Indeed you are." Monroe adjusted his hat. "Funny thing about those fellas, they've got all the proper documentation, but something about their story doesn't sit right with me. Been telegraphing some contacts in Denver, asking discreet questions." Jack remained silent, waiting. Monroe wasn't a man to make social calls, especially not in February with snow threatening on the horizon. "This Hayes fellow," Monroe continued, "has quite a reputation, wealthy businessman, contributes generously to politicians. Widower before he married the current Mrs. Hayes." The sheriff's weathered face remained impassive. His first wife died under circumstances some found questionable, though nothing was ever proven. "That's so?" Jack kept his tone neutral despite the chill that ran down his spine. Monroe nodded. "Thought you might find that interesting, considering your cousin's arrival coincided with Mrs. Hayes' disappearance." He held up a hand as Jack tensed. "Not making accusations, Thornton, just sharing information between neighbors." "Appreciate the consideration," Jack said carefully. "One more thing," Monroe added, reaching into his coat. He withdrew a folded newspaper. "Thought your cousin might want to see this. Latest from Denver." Jack accepted the paper, noting it was folded to display a particular article. He didn't open it immediately, maintaining eye contact with the sheriff. "Anything else I should know?" Monroe glanced at the darkening sky. "Storm coming tomorrow. Might want to secure anything that could blow away." He turned toward his horse, then paused. "Oh, and Thornton, if you were thinking of traveling soon, I'd recommend waiting. Pinkerton men have men watching the main trails out of the area." With that, the sheriff mounted and rode away, leaving Jack standing in the doorway with the newspaper in his hand and an increasing sense of unease. Sarah emerged from the bedroom once the sound of hoofbeats faded, Maggie held close against her chest, the Colt still in her right hand. "What did he want?" she asked, her face pale with tension. Jack closed the door, securing the bar across it before unfolding the newspaper. The article was brief but illuminating. Headlined, "Hayes Increases Reward for Missing Wife." According to the report, William Hayes had doubled the reward to $1,000, adding allegations that his wife had not only murdered their newborn son, but had kidnapped a rancher's infant daughter after killing the father who had given her shelter. Sarah sank into a chair, the blood draining from her face as Jack read the article aloud. "He's made me a child murderer and kidnapper," she whispered, her voice hollow with disbelief. "Standard tactic," Jack said grimly. "Ensure no one would consider helping you. Make you not just a fugitive, but a monster." He set the paper aside. "Monroe brought this as a warning. He suspects who you are." Fear flashed across Sarah's features. Will he report us? If he were going to do that, he'd have brought the Pinkerton men with him. Jack considered the sheriff's veiled messages. I think he's giving us time to decide our next move. Which is what? Sarah asked, her voice steadier than her expression. Where can we go that Hayes won't follow? $1,000 would tempt almost anyone. Jack moved to the window, peering out at the gathering dusk. $1,000 was indeed a fortune in these parts, enough to buy a decent ranch outright. The kind of money that turned neighbors into informants and strangers into hunters. My mother's brother, James, has a place in Arizona territory, he said finally. We left on good terms. He'd help us if we could reach him. Arizona? Sarah's eyes widened. That's hundreds of miles south. And the last place Hayes would expect you to run in the dead of winter, Jack pointed out. Everyone would assume you'd head east toward more civilization, not deeper into frontier territory. Sarah considered this, absently soothing Maggie, who had begun to fuss. How would we get there? Monroe said the trails are being watched. Not all of them. Jack turned from the window. There are old hunting paths through the mountains. Difficult traveling, especially with a baby, but passable with the right preparation. When? Not yet. Jack shook his head. We wait until spring. The passes would be suicidal before April, and we need time to prepare. He crossed to the trunk at the foot of his bed and unlocked it, removing a small leather pouch. I have some money saved, enough to outfit us properly when the time comes. Sarah watched him, her expression a complex mixture of fear, gratitude, and something else. Something that made Jack look away before he could identify it too clearly. Why are you doing this, Jack? She asked softly. You could turn me in tomorrow, collect the reward, secure Maggie's future. Instead, you're risking everything. Jack returned the pouch to the trunk, considering his answer. The truth was, he wasn't entirely sure himself. Part of it was certainly his instinctive distrust of men like Hayes, wealthy manipulators who twisted the law to their advantage. Part was his growing certainty that Sarah's version of events was true, based on the genuine care she showed Maggie and the fear that haunted her eyes. But there was something else, something he wasn't ready to acknowledge even to himself. Let's just say I've been on the wrong side of powerful men before, he finally answered, and I've never much cared for bullies. The storm Monroe had predicted arrived the next day, howling around the cabin with vengeful fury. Jack secured the livestock in the barn, then spent the day reinforcing the cabin windows against the wind. Sarah kept Maggie close, singing softly to distract the infant from the frightening noises outside. By evening, the storm had intensified to a full blizzard, snow accumulating rapidly against the north side of the cabin. Jack built up the fire, his thoughts turning to the practicalities of their eventual journey south. They would need supplies, weapons, sturdy horses, a pack mule perhaps, maps of the territories they would cross, and above all, a plan for keeping Maggie safe during what would certainly be a dangerous trek. Jack, Sarah called from the window, interrupting his planning. There's something out there. He joined her, peering through the curtain into the swirling white chaos beyond. At first, he saw nothing but the storm. Then a flicker of movement caught his eye, too deliberate to be wind-blown debris, too large to be wildlife. Get back from the window, he said quietly, reaching for the Winchester. Take Maggie to the bedroom. Sarah complied immediately, years of fear having honed her reactions to potential danger. Jack positioned himself beside the window rather than in front of it, minimizing his silhouette while maintaining a view of the yard. The movement came again, a dark shape materializing briefly through the curtain of snow before disappearing again. Jack's jaw tightened. Someone was out there, and only a fool or someone with desperate purpose would brave such conditions. The minutes stretched into an hour of tense vigilance. Jack remained at his post, watching as the shadowy figure circled the cabin at a distance, appearing and vanishing like a specter in the storm. Whoever it was made no attempt to approach directly, seemingly content to observe rather than engage. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, the figure retreated toward the tree line and disappeared completely. Jack maintained his position for another hour, ensuring the watcher had truly departed rather than merely changing location. They're gone, he eventually told Sarah, who had remained in the bedroom doorway, Colt in hand, ready to defend Maggie if necessary. Who was it? She asked, her voice steady despite the tension evident in her posture. Couldn't see clearly. Too much snow. Jack set the rifle aside but kept it within easy reach. Could have been a lost traveler seeking shelter. You don't believe that? No, he met her gaze directly. I don't. They took turns keeping watch through the night, though the mysterious observer did not return. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving a transformed landscape of pristine drifts and ice-crystallized trees that sparkled blindingly in the winter sun. Jack ventured out at first light, tracking the visitor's trail before it could be obscured by wind or fresh snowfall. The footprints led to the edge of the property where they were joined by hoofprints, indicating the watcher had tethered his mount at a distance to approach more stealthily on foot. Jack followed the tracks for a mile until they joined a more traveled path heading toward town. He returned to the cabin, his expression grim. Professional, he told Sarah. Kept downwind, maintained distance, never exposed himself unnecessarily. Pinkerton? Sarah asked, her face pale but composed. Jack shook his head. Their men are methodical, but they operate within the law. This was someone else, someone accustomed to stalking human prey. Sarah shuddered visibly. Hayes has sent others. Seems likely. Jack began gathering supplies into his saddlebags. I need to go to town, see what I can learn. Is that wise? Sarah's concern was evident. If they're watching the cabin, then they already know I'm here, Jack pointed out. Better to learn what we can than wait for them to make the first move. He checked the action on his Colt before sliding it into its holster. Bar the door after I leave. Don't open it for anyone but me, no matter what they say. Sarah nodded, shifting Maggie to her hip. The infant had grown noticeably in the weeks since Sarah's arrival, her features becoming more distinct, resembling Elizabeth around the eyes and Jack in the stubborn set of her small jaw. Be careful, Sarah said softly as Jack prepared to depart. He paused at the door, struck by the domestic tableau they presented. A woman holding a child, concern for him, written plainly on her face. For a moment, it was almost possible to believe this was normal, that they were simply a family rather than fugitives awaiting discovery. I'll be back before dark, he promised. Redemption Creek was busier than Jack expected, the main street crowded despite the recent storm. He left his horse at the livery stable and made his way toward Cooper's Saloon, the most reliable source of information in town. As he walked, he noted the presence of several unfamiliar faces, hard-looking men who watched passers-by with predatory attention. Inside the saloon, the usual afternoon crowd had gathered, local ranchers and townsmen seeking warmth and companionship to break the monotony of winter isolation. Jack ordered a whiskey, positioning himself at the bar where he could observe the room while appearing casual. Thornton, Cooper greeted him, sliding a glass across the scarred wood. Been a while. Thought maybe that last storm buried you out there. Jack shook his head. Takes more than snow to keep me down. Good to hear. Cooper leaned in, lowering his voice. Might interest you to know those Pinkerton fellas were asking about you yesterday, wanting to know your schedule, how often you come to town. Jack kept his expression neutral as he sipped his whiskey. That right? What did you tell them? Said you're a private man, irregular habits. Cooper shrugged. None of their business anyway. Appreciate that, Jim. Jack pushed a coin across the bar. Seen any other strangers around, besides the Pinkerton men? Cooper's eyes shifted briefly toward a corner table where three men sat apart from the general crowd. Showed up 2 days ago. Don't talk much. Drink less. Been asking questions too, but not as polite as the city boys. Jack resisted the urge to look directly at the men, instead using the mirror behind the bar to study their reflections. Two were nondescript, the kind of weathered drifters common in frontier towns. The third, however, caught Jack's attention immediately. Tall and lean, with a puckered scar running from temple to jaw on the left side of his face. His posture was relaxed, but Jack recognized the alertness in his pale eyes, constantly scanning the room with professional assessment. Bounty hunters, Jack murmured, recognizing the type from his own past. Men who tracked humans for money, operating in the nebulous territory between lawful pursuit and murder for hire. Figured as much, Cooper agreed. Sheriff's keeping an eye on them, but they haven't broken any laws yet, just making everyone nervous with their questions. Jack finished his whiskey, considering his options. The presence of bounty hunters complicated matters significantly. Unlike the Pinkerton agents with their methodical approach and concern for legal niceties, bounty hunters were motivated solely by the reward. They would have fewer compunctions about collateral damage, including harm to Maggie or himself if they stood between the hunters and their quarry. Thanks for the warning, Jack said, pushing away from the bar. Think I'll stock up on supplies and head back before the light fails. Wise choice, Cooper agreed. Word is another storm's brewing, bigger than the last. Jack nodded and departed, aware of the scarred man's eyes following him out. Outside, he moved purposefully toward Wilson's general store, mentally adjusting his plans. They couldn't wait until spring. The presence of bounty hunters changed everything. Martha Wilson greeted him warmly as he entered the store, but Jack noted the concern in her kind eyes. "Jack, wasn't expecting to see you again so soon. How's little Maggie doing?" "Growing stronger every day," he answered, handing her a list of supplies. "Need to stock up before the next storm hits." Martha nodded, gathering the items with efficient movements. "Your cousin's been good for her, I expect." "Nothing like a woman's touch for raising a baby." Jack made a non-committal sound, wondering how much gossip had spread about Sarah's presence at his cabin. Martha continued chatting as she worked, providing valuable information within her seemingly innocent conversation. "Those Pinkerton men were asking about her, you know. Your cousin seemed mighty interested in when exactly she arrived." Martha glanced at Jack significantly. "I told them I wasn't aware you had any family nearby, but that folks often reconnect when tragedy strikes." "Appreciate that, Martha." She lowered her voice as she wrapped parcels in brown paper. "Sheriff asked me to tell you, if you came in today, that he's got business out by Miller's Creek tomorrow. Won't be back till late. Said you might find that information useful, though I can't imagine why." Jack understood immediately. Monroe was giving him a window of opportunity, a day when the law would be conveniently absent from Redemption Creek. The sheriff was walking a fine line between his duty and his personal sense of justice. "Tell him I'm obliged for the consideration," Jack replied quietly. Martha nodded, adding extra ammunition to his order without being asked. "You be careful out there, Jack Thornton. Those hills have eyes these days." Jack paid for his supplies and departed, loading them onto his horse with deliberate movements, giving no outward sign of his accelerated plans. As he mounted, he caught sight of the scarred bounty hunter, watching from the boardwalk across the street, making no effort to conceal his interest. Their eyes met briefly, a moment of silent acknowledgement between predators. Jack touched the brim of his hat in sardonic greeting before turning his horse toward home, maintaining an unhurried pace until he was beyond the town limits. Once out of sight, he urged his mount to greater speed, taking a circuitous route back to the cabin in case he was followed. The afternoon sun was already descending toward the western mountains, the air growing sharper with approaching night. Jack reached the cabin as dusk gathered, relieved to find it undisturbed. Sarah opened the door at his signal, Colt in hand, her tense expression relaxing only slightly at the sight of him. "We need to leave," he said without preamble, bringing his supplies inside. "Tonight." Sarah's eyes widened, but she asked no questions, immediately beginning to gather their belongings. "What happened?" "Bounty hunters in town," Jack explained, checking his weapons with practiced efficiency. "3 that I saw, likely more we haven't. They won't wait for spring, and they won't care about legalities like the Pinkerton men." He met her gaze directly. "They'll burn this cabin down around us, if that's what it takes to collect their $1,000. Sarah paled but continued her preparations, her movements quick and decisive. "Where will we go? You said the mountain passes were suicidal before April." "South first," Jack decided, mentally plotting their route. "There's an old trapper's cabin in a hidden valley about 40 miles from here. We can shelter there while I scout the safest path toward Arizona." Sarah nodded, wrapping Maggie in layers of warm clothing and blankets. The infant, seeming to sense the tension, remained unusually quiet, her large eyes following their movements. "We'll need to travel light," Jack continued. "1 horse each, only essential supplies." He reached into his coat, withdrawing a folded document. "Monroe gave me this, map of the old hunting trails the Pinkerton men don't know about." Sarah accepted the map, studying it briefly before tucking it securely inside her dress. "The sheriff is helping us?" "In his way." Jack checked the window, noting the gathering darkness. "He's a good man caught between his duty and his conscience. Doesn't believe Hayes' story, but can't officially help fugitives either." They worked in efficient silence, gathering only what was absolutely necessary for survival. Warm clothing, weapons and ammunition, preserved food, medical supplies. Jack emptied his money pouch, dividing the cash between various hidden pockets in their clothing. "If we get separated," he instructed, "head south by southwest. Follow the North Platte River until you reach the old Miller homestead. Wait there 3 days. If I don't come, continue southwest toward Arizona territory." Sarah nodded, memorizing his instructions even as she prayed they wouldn't be needed. As she secured the last of their provisions, a sound from outside froze them both in place. Hoofbeats. Multiple riders approaching slowly through the darkness. Jack extinguished the lamp with a swift movement, plunging the cabin into darkness. "Back door," he whispered, gathering their prepared saddlebags, quickly and quietly. Sarah clutched Maggie to her chest, following Jack through the darkened cabin toward the small rear exit he had built as a precaution when first constructing the home. They slipped outside into the bitter cold, the night sky brilliant with stars that illuminated the snow-covered landscape with ghostly light. Jack led the way to the barn, where their horses were already saddled and waiting, his foresight now proving invaluable. As they mounted, the sound of men's voices carried from the front of the cabin, followed by a sharp command. "Thornton, we know you're in there. Send out the woman and we'll let you keep breathing." The scarred bounty hunter's voice carried clearly through the night air, his confidence suggesting he believed they were trapped inside. Jack guided his horse out the rear of the barn, Sarah following close behind, Maggie secured against her body in an improvised sling. They had nearly reached the tree line when a shout announced their discovery. A rifle shot cracked through the night, the bullet whistling harmlessly overhead, more warning than serious attempt. "Ride," Jack commanded, spurring his horse forward into the shelter of the forest. "Don't look back." Sarah obeyed, leaning low over her mount's neck as they plunged into the darkness, leaving behind the only safety she had known since fleeing Denver. Behind them, more shouts erupted, followed by the sounds of pursuit. The chase had begun. 3 months of borrowed time had ended. Whatever fragile peace they had found in that isolated cabin was now another memory to carry as they fled into the wilderness, toward an uncertain future in the promise of either freedom or death. The cold night embraced them, swallowing their figures as they rode deeper into the forest. The stars, their only witnesses, as another chapter in their story closed and a more dangerous one began. Moonlight transformed the snow-covered forest into a ghostly landscape of silver and shadow as Jack and Sarah fled deeper into the wilderness. The February night air burned in their lungs, cold so intense it seemed alive, a predator more patient and deadly than the men pursuing them. Jack led the way along game trails barely visible beneath the snow, his years of frontier experience guiding them through terrain that would confound less experienced riders. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit gradually faded, though Jack harbored no illusions about their escape. The bounty hunters would return at first light, following their tracks with the relentless determination of men motivated by the promise of a $1,000 reward. Their only advantage lay in the weather and Jack's intimate knowledge of the surrounding territory. They rode for hours without speaking, pushing the horses as hard as they dared in the treacherous conditions. Maggie remained miraculously quiet in her sling against Sarah's chest, as if the infant somehow understood the gravity of their situation. When they finally stopped to rest the animals in a sheltered hollow, Sarah's face was pale with cold, her breath forming crystalline clouds in the frigid air. "How much farther?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Another few hours," Jack replied, checking Maggie with gentle hands. The baby was warm despite the cold, bundled securely in layers of wool and rabbit fur. "We need to reach the valley before dawn." Sarah nodded, too exhausted for further conversation. Jack studied her face in the moonlight, noting the determination that outweighed the fear in her eyes. She had proven herself stronger than he'd initially assumed, adapting to each new challenge with a quiet resilience that earned his deepening respect. They continued their journey through the night, following an ancient riverbed that wound between steep hills. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, both humans and horses were nearing exhaustion. Jack finally called a halt as they crested a ridge overlooking a narrow valley nestled between towering pines. Below, barely visible in the pre-dawn light, stood a crude log structure partially buried in snow. "The trapper's cabin," he said, pointing. "We'll shelter there." The cabin proved even more rudimentary than Jack had remembered. A single room with a stone fireplace, roof beams blackened by years of smoke, and gaps between the logs that allowed the winter wind to whistle through. Still, it offered concealment and the promise of warmth once a fire was built. Jack tended to the horses while Sarah carried Maggie inside, clearing years of dust and animal droppings from one corner where they could establish their temporary home. By the time Jack joined them, she had located the cabin's meager amenities: an iron cookpot, a wooden bench, and a stack of moldering furs that could be salvaged for bedding once properly cleaned. "It's not much," Jack acknowledged as he began building a fire in the long-dormant hearth. "It's shelter," Sarah replied simply, settling on the floor with Maggie cradled in her arms. The infant had awakened and begun to fuss, hungry after the long night's journey. Jack busied himself with the fire, allowing Sarah the privacy to feed the baby. As flames finally caught and began to warm the cabin's interior, he considered their situation with clear-eyed pragmatism. They had escaped immediate danger, but their respite would be temporary at best. The bounty hunters would track them eventually, and the brutal February weather presented its own life-threatening challenges. "We can't stay here long," he said, breaking the silence. "A day to rest, maybe two. Then we need to keep moving south." Sarah nodded, her attention focused on Maggie. "The mountain passes? Still dangerous this time of year, but we have no choice." Jack moved to the cabin's single window, a crude opening covered with an animal hide that served as a shutter. He peered out at the lightening sky, searching for any sign of pursuit. "Hayes won't stop. Not now." "No," Sarah agreed, her voice hollow with resignation. He never could accept losing anything he considered his property. Jack turned from the window, studying her face in the growing firelight. "Tell me about him," he said. "Everything you know. If we're going to outmaneuver him, I need to understand how he thinks." Sarah was silent for a long moment, gathering her thoughts as she adjusted Maggie at her breast. "William Hayes is the son of a coal mine owner from Pennsylvania," she finally began. "His father built the business through brutal labor practices, breaking strikes with violence when necessary. William inherited not just the fortune, but the methods. He expanded into railroads, banking, land speculation. Everything he touched seemed to multiply his wealth. Denver society celebrated him as a self-made success, never questioning the bodies he climbed over to reach those heights." She closed her eyes briefly. "Including his first wife." "What happened to her?" Jack asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Catherine Hayes fell down the main staircase of their mansion," Sarah replied. "The official verdict was a tragic accident. The servants whispered otherwise." Her gaze met Jack's, unflinching. She had begun asking questions about financial irregularities, threatening to contact her influential family back east. "And no one investigated?" William had already purchased half the city officials in Denver by then. The remaining half were indebted to him for favors or terrified of his retribution. She stroked Maggie's head absently. "When my father died, leaving substantial medical debts, William appeared like a savior. I thought I was making a prudent choice for my future. When I became pregnant, his control became absolute. The heir to his empire required perfect conditions," he said. "I was merely the vessel." Her voice remained steady, but her eyes reflected remembered humiliation. "The doctor he hired reported to William directly, treating me like livestock rather than a patient." Jack felt his hands tighten into fists, anger building at the calculated cruelty. "And when the baby was stillborn, William wasn't there for the birth. When he returned and found his son had died, he refused to believe it was natural causes. Accused me of deliberately sabotaging the pregnancy to spite him." Her breathing quickened with the painful memory. "I overheard him instructing the doctor to prepare commitment papers. He planned to have me declared insane, institutionalized, while he maintained the public fiction of a grieving, devoted husband." Jack nodded, adding these details to his mental assessment of Hayes. "A man accustomed to absolute control, unused to defeat, with resources that far outstrip their own. A dangerous adversary under any circumstances, made more dangerous by his belief that Sarah was his property to be reclaimed." "We'll reach Arizona," Jack said with quiet determination. "Hayes may have money and men, but he doesn't know this territory. I do." He didn't add the obvious, that even if they reached his brother's ranch, Hayes's influence could eventually extend there as well. They spent the rest of the day recovering from their flight, sleeping in shifts while the other kept watch. That evening, as darkness settled over the valley, Jack found himself watching Sarah as she sang softly to Maggie, a lullaby he didn't recognize with words in what sounded like French. "My mother's language," Sarah explained, catching his questioning look. "She came from Quebec. The song is about a little bird finding its way home through the forest." Jack nodded, oddly moved by this glimpse into her past. In the firelight, with Maggie cradled against her, Sarah appeared both younger and somehow stronger than the frightened woman who had appeared at his door during the storm. Despite everything she had endured, something essential remained unbroken within her. "We should leave tomorrow," he said, reluctantly breaking the moment of peace. "Head south toward the Medicine Bow Range. There's a pass that should be navigable, even this time of year." Sarah nodded, her expression turning serious once more. "And if they find us before then?" Jack checked the Colt holstered at his hip, a habitual gesture born from years of frontier vigilance. "Then we make our stand, but they won't find us easily." He met her gaze directly. I won't let Hayes take you back, Sarah. Not while I'm breathing. The simple declaration hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither was prepared to articulate fully. Something had shifted in their relationship during these weeks together, evolving from desperate necessity to a deeper connection neither had anticipated. Thank you, Sarah said softly, holding his gaze for a moment before looking down at Maggie, now sleeping peacefully in her arms. As they prepared for sleep, Jack noticed movement outside the cabin's single window, a shadow passing briefly across the moonlit snow, too deliberate to be wildlife. He signaled Sarah to remain silent, moving with practiced stealth to position himself beside the window. For nearly an hour, he maintained his vigilant watch, catching occasional glimpses of a figure circling the cabin at a careful distance. Not approaching directly, but observing, assessing. When the figure finally retreated toward the tree line, Jack remained at his post for another hour, ensuring the watcher had truly departed. Someone was out there, he told Sarah quietly, watching, professional. Pinkerton? Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the fear evident in her posture. Jack shook his head. Don't think so. Their men are methodical, but they operate within the law. This was someone else, someone accustomed to stalking human prey. Hayes has sent others, Sarah concluded. Seems likely. Jack checked his weapons with meticulous care. We leave at first light. They departed as planned, dawn barely breaking over the eastern mountains. The day proved brutally cold, the sky a hard, cloudless blue that offered no hint of approaching storms, but promised no warmth either. Jack led them southwest, following game trails and dry creek beds that would be more difficult to track than obvious paths through the snow. They made good progress that day and the next, pushing the horses as much as they dared while ensuring Maggie remained warm and protected from the elements. By the third day, the terrain had grown increasingly rugged as they approached the mountain range that separated them from the relative safety of Colorado territory. Jack grew more vigilant with each passing mile, constantly scanning their surroundings for signs of pursuit or potential danger. Those instincts saved them late on the fourth day. They had stopped to water the horses at a half-frozen stream when Jack suddenly stiffened, his hand moving automatically to the colt at his hip. Sarah, recognizing the gesture from their weeks together, immediately fell silent, her own hand dropping to the revolver he had insisted she keep with her. Jack signaled to her to remain still, then moved quietly toward a rocky outcropping that offered a view of the trail behind them. He lay flat against the cold stone, scanning the distant path they had traveled. At first, he saw nothing but pristine white landscape. Then movement caught his eye. 3 riders following their trail with methodical precision, still distant but unmistakably headed in their direction. Bounty hunters, he told Sarah upon returning. 3 of them, including the scarred man from Redemption Creek. They're tracking us. Sarah's face paled, but her voice remained steady. How far behind? Hour, maybe less. Jack quickly gathered their supplies. We need to move, now. They rode hard for the next 2 hours, pushing toward the mountain pass that offered their best hope of escape. The terrain grew steeper, the path narrowing as they ascended into the Medicine Bow Range. By late afternoon, they had reached the approach to the pass, a narrow defile between towering rock faces. Recent snowfall had made the trail treacherous, with drifts that could easily hide deadly drops or loose footing. We'll have to lead the horses through, Jack decided, dismounting. Take it slow and careful. They proceeded cautiously, Jack breaking trail while Sarah followed with the horses. The wind intensified as they moved higher into the pass, cutting through their clothing with icy precision. They had traversed perhaps half the pass when Jack suddenly raised his hand, signaling Sarah to stop. Then she heard it too, the distant crack of a rifle shot, followed by the unmistakable whine of a bullet ricocheting off stone nearby. Take cover! Jack shouted, pulling Sarah and the horses behind a large boulder as another shot rang out, closer this time. They're trying to pin us in the pass, he said grimly, peering around the edge of their shelter. The bounty hunters had split up, positioning themselves at strategic points along the rocky walls of the defile. A classic ambush setup. What do we do? Sarah asked, clutching Maggie close. The infant, disturbed by the sudden movement and loud noises, had begun to cry, her wails carrying in the confined space. Jack assessed their options with rapid clarity. I'll draw their fire, he decided, checking the action on his rifle. Create a distraction. When I do, you take Maggie and the horses and push through to the other side of the pass. No? Sarah's refusal was immediate and vehement. We stay together. I can shoot too, remember? Sarah. Jack met her gaze directly. One of us has to get Maggie to safety. You're her mother now in every way that matters." His voice softened slightly, "And I've faced worse odds." Before she could protest further, a bullet struck dangerously close to their position. Jack made his decision, slipping extra ammunition into his coat pocket. "When you hear me engaging them from the eastern slope, that's when you move. Don't hesitate. Don't look back." He hesitated, then added gruffly, "If I don't catch up with you by nightfall, keep heading southwest. Find my brother James in Prescott. Tell him what happened." Sarah grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Jack Thornton, you'd better be right behind me." Jack nodded once, then slipped away, moving with the stealth and precision of a man who had spent his life in environments where a single mistake meant death. He circled behind their position, using the rocky terrain for cover as he worked his way up the eastern slope. Taking careful aim with his rifle, Jack fired at the nearest hunter. The shot echoed through the pass, and the man crumpled without a sound. Immediately, return fire erupted from the other positions. Jack fired twice more in rapid succession, forcing the remaining hunters to keep their heads down. From his peripheral vision, he saw Sarah seize the opportunity, leading the horses at a run through the narrowest part of the pass. Jack continued firing at measured intervals, creating the impression of a determined defense rather than a delaying action. Then a sound from behind made him whirl, raising his rifle in one fluid motion. The scarred bounty hunter stood 20 feet away, revolver already drawn. They fired simultaneously. Jack felt the burning slash of a bullet across his left shoulder as his own shot caught the hunter in the chest. The man slid down, leaving a crimson smear on the stone, his pale eyes fixed on Jack with something like recognition. "Knew it was you," he gasped, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "Deadeye Thornton, Kansas." Jack approached cautiously, rifle trained on the dying man. "Who hired you?" he demanded. "Hayes directly, or the Pinkerton men?" "Hayes came himself, 1,000 now. 4 more when delivered." A rattling breath escaped him. "Woman alive, unharmed. You, optional." Jack's jaw tightened at the confirmation. The price on Sarah's head now stood at $5,000, a fortune that would attract the most dangerous mercenaries across the territories. "Hayes is in Cheyenne," the dying man volunteered unexpectedly. "Waiting there," his eyes fixed on something beyond Jack. "Always hated working for rich men." A final shuddering breath, then stillness. Moving quickly despite the wound in his shoulder, Jack gathered his rifle and began making his way through the pass in Sarah's wake. He caught up with her just as the pass widened into its western approach, finding her sheltered in a small hollow formed by fallen trees and rock. "You're hurt," she said immediately, noticing his awkward gait. "Grazed." Jack eased himself down beside her, finally allowing himself to acknowledge the burning pain across his shoulder. "How's Maggie?" "Sleeping, finally." Sarah gestured to where the infant lay bundled securely among their saddlebags. "What happened back there?" "2 down, 1 still out there somewhere." Jack winced as Sarah helped him remove his coat to examine the wound. "Scarred man talked before he died. Hayes is in Cheyenne, waiting for them to deliver you. $5,000 now." Sarah's hands stilled momentarily on his bloodied shirt. 5,000? The sum was staggering, enough to buy a substantial ranch outright. "Men like Hayes don't accept defeat," Jack hissed as she cleaned the wound with snow, the cold providing both pain and numbing relief simultaneously. They established a coal camp, unwilling to risk a fire that might reveal their position. Huddled together beneath blankets and the salvaged buffalo robe from the dead hunter's coat, they shared jerky and hardtack, taking turns holding Maggie between them to share body warmth. As darkness settled fully over the mountains, the first snowflakes began to fall, gradually increasing until the world beyond their small shelter disappeared into a swirling, white void. Jack found himself oddly grateful for the storm's arrival. It would make pursuit nearly impossible. "We should reach Colorado territory by tomorrow evening," he said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Less likely to encounter bounty hunters there. Hayes's influence might not extend as far." "Do you really believe that?" Sarah asked softly. Jack considered his answer carefully. "I believe we can reach Arizona," he said finally. "My brother has connections, friends in the territorial government. Hayes is powerful, but even power has limits when stretched across sufficient distance." Sarah nodded, accepting his assessment without further question. After a moment, she spoke again, her voice barely audible above the wind. "When this is over, If we survive, what then, Jack? The question caught him unprepared, forcing him to confront possibilities he had deliberately avoided examining too closely. What did come after, assuming they escaped Hayes's vengeance? I don't know, he admitted honestly. Haven't thought beyond getting us to safety. Sarah's gaze remained on the sleeping infant. I've been thinking about what might be possible. Her voice held a cautious hope. Maybe a small place somewhere, not too isolated, somewhere Maggie could attend school eventually. You'd stay with her? Jack asked, already knowing the answer. How could I not? Sarah's arms tightened slightly around the baby. She saved me as surely as I saved her. Before I found your cabin, I'd been walking for days, half hoping to die in the snow. Her voice dropped even lower. Then I heard her cry through the storm, and something inside me remembered how to hope again. Jack nodded, understanding completely. Maggie had provided similar salvation for him, giving purpose to days that had seemed meaningless after Elizabeth's death. The child had become a bridge between two damaged souls, creating an unexpected family from the wreckage of separate tragedies. We'll find a place, he said, the decision forming even as he spoke the words. Together, somewhere Hayes can't reach. Morning brought crystalline clarity, the storm having passed during the night to leave a transformed landscape. They broke camp efficiently, leaving no trace of their presence as they continued southwest. By midday, they had crossed into Colorado territory, the boundary marked only by a weathered wooden sign half buried in snowdrifts. Jack allowed himself a small measure of relief at this milestone. While Hayes's influence certainly extended beyond Wyoming's borders, the deeper they penetrated into the mountainous territory, the more difficult it would be for strangers to track them without local knowledge. They pushed on through the afternoon, making good time on a trail that gradually became more established. As dusk approached, they came upon an unexpected sight, thin smoke rising from a sheltered valley ahead. Jack signaled for caution, leading them to a vantage point overlooking the source of the smoke. Below, a small encampment spread along a half-frozen stream, several hide-covered structures, horses in a crude corral, and figures moving about evening tasks. Not white settlers, but a small band of what appeared to be Ute Indians. We should avoid them, Sarah said quietly, eyeing the camp with understandable wariness. Relations between settlers and native peoples remained unpredictable at best. Jack studied the camp with more nuanced assessment. Not necessarily. The Ute know these mountains better than anyone. Might provide valuable information about the safest routes south. He glanced at the darkening sky. And Maggie needs proper shelter tonight. Before Sarah could object, a voice spoke from directly behind them. Too late for that plan. They whirled to find 3 Ute warriors standing silently behind them, rifles and bows at the ready. Jack and Sarah had been so focused on the camp below that they'd failed to notice the hunting party returning from the opposite direction. Jack slowly raised his hands, keeping them well away from his weapons. We mean no harm, he said clearly. Seeking passage south, have injured woman and child needing shelter. The oldest of the warriors studied them impassively. His gaze lingered on Sarah and Maggie, then shifted to the blood-stained bandage visible beneath Jack's coat. White man's trouble follows you, he stated rather than asked, his English accented but clear. Jack saw no point in denial. Yes, but not trouble for your people. The warrior considered this, then gestured toward the camp below. Come, Walking Fox will decide. They were escorted down to the encampment, drawing curious stares from the inhabitants. Inside the largest structure, an elderly man sat beside a small fire, his deeply lined face reflecting decades of survival in an increasingly hostile world. Walking Fox, chief of this small band, listened silently as the warriors explained where they had found Jack and Sarah. Sit, he finally said, gesturing to spaces across the fire. Share our warmth. Jack and Sarah settled carefully, Maggie still bundled securely against Sarah's chest. You run from white man's justice? Walking Fox asked directly, watching Jack's face for truth. No, Jack replied with equal directness. From white man's injustice. The woman's husband seeks to reclaim her through violence and lies. She fled his cruelty. Now bounty hunters pursue us. Walking Fox nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he already suspected. Money makes some men forget their humanity. He gestured toward Maggie. The child? Mine, Jack said, the simple declaration feeling right despite its technical inaccuracy. Her mother died. This woman saved her life. The chief studied Sarah more carefully, noting how naturally she held the infant, the protective way her body curved around the small bundle. Whatever he saw appeared to satisfy him. "You seek passage through our hunting grounds," he stated. "To where?" "Arizona territory," Jack answered. "My brother has land there, place we can start anew. Long journey, many dangers, not just from those who hunt you." "We have no choice." Sarah spoke for the first time, her voice steady. "The man pursuing me would rather see me dead than free." The elderly chief regarded her with unexpected compassion. "My people understand such pursuit. We too have been hunted from our ancestral lands by those who see only possession, not humanity." He gestured to one of the women hovering nearby. "Bring food, tend the man's wound." While Jack's wound was being treated with surprising skill, Walking Fox continued his assessment. "Your passage will be difficult, heavy snow and mountains, paths treacherous until spring thaw." "Is there a safer route?" Sarah asked. Walking Fox nodded slowly. "Western path, longer but lower elevation, less snow, but you must cross Great River, and Navajo lands beyond." Jack considered this information. The western route would indeed avoid the highest mountain passes, but would add weeks to their journey and take them through territories where different challenges awaited. "Would your people guide us?" he asked directly. "I can pay." Walking Fox shook his head. "Not with money. We have no use for white man's paper." He gestured toward Jack's rifle. "But weapons, ammunition, these have value." "The Winchester and 40 rounds," Jack offered, "in exchange for safe passage to the Colorado River." The chief considered this, then nodded once. "Acceptable. My grandson, Swift Horse, will guide you. He speaks good English, knows the western trails." That night, warmed by the small fire permitted in their temporary shelter, Jack and Sarah spoke quietly of the journey ahead. Swift Horse had described a route that would take them west through mountain valleys, then south along the western slope of the Rockies, avoiding the highest and most treacherous passes. The journey would require at least 3 weeks. "Can we trust them?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Walking Fox is a man of honor. His word means something," Jack replied. "Besides, the Winchester is valuable enough to ensure good faith, and they have no reason to harm us." Sarah nodded, accepting his assessment. "What happens when we reach Arizona? Even there, $5,000 will tempt many men. My brother James has connections with the territorial governor. Might be able to arrange some official protection, at least initially." Jack met her gaze directly. "But ultimately, Hayes will only stop when he's convinced you're beyond his reach permanently." "Or dead," Sarah added softly. "That would satisfy him too. His pride would accept my death more easily than my escape." "We'll find a way," he promised, reaching across the space between them to take her hand. Together. Dawn brought renewed purpose in the beginning of the next phase of their journey. Swift Horse, a serious young man of perhaps 25, arrived as they prepared to depart. 3 days to reach Western Valleys, he informed them, securing additional supplies to his own mount. Must travel quickly. More snow coming. Jack handed over the Winchester and ammunition as promised. Walking Fox supervised the transfer, then approached Sarah, who stood nearby with Maggie. The elderly chief reached into a pouch at his waist and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft leather. "For the child," he said, offering the bundle to Sarah. "Protection on long journey." Sarah accepted the gift, carefully unwrapping it to reveal a small amulet carved from pale stone, depicting a stylized bear. "Thank you," she said, genuinely moved by the unexpected kindness. Walking Fox touched Maggie's forehead gently. "Strong spirit in small body," he observed. "Like new shoot after forest fire. Life continuing despite destruction." He stepped back, raising his hand in farewell. "May Creator watch over your path." They departed with the first rays of sun, Swift Horse leading the way along trails invisible to less experienced eyes. For 3 days, they traveled through breathtaking winter landscape, Swift Horse's knowledge guiding them through passages that avoided the worst of the snow and dangerous terrain. "Tomorrow we reach Trading Post," the Ute informed them as they made camp on the 3rd night. "Last white settlement before Navajo lands. Can get supplies there, but dangerous too. Men there talk. Word spreads." Jack nodded, understanding the warning. Any contact with settlements increased the risk of information about their passage reaching Hayes or his hired men. "I'll go alone," he decided. "Sarah and Maggie will remain hidden with you outside the settlement." The trading post proved to be a collection of crude log structures clustered around a central building. Several horses stood hitched outside, suggesting current visitors. Jack approached the main building alone, his senses alert for any sign of danger. Inside, the trading post offered the expected assortment of supplies, weapons, and basic necessities. The proprietor, a heavy-set man with one clouded eye, assessed Jack with practiced neutrality. "Coffee, flour, salt," Jack requested, placing coins on the counter. "Ammunition for Colt 45. As the man turned to measure coffee beans, Jack noticed the wall behind the counter. Dozens of wanted posters and reward notices, including one featuring a crude sketch of Sarah with the promised $5,000 reward prominently displayed. "Quite a sum," the proprietor commented, noting the direction of Jack's gaze. "Woman must have done something terrible." Jack maintained his neutral expression. "Heard she killed her baby. Hard to believe." "Rich folks' justice," the man replied with a philosophical shrug. "Truth don't matter much when you can afford to print your own." He pushed the supplies across the counter. "Heading south?" "West," Jack lied smoothly. "Got family in Nevada." At the door, Jack paused, one final question necessary despite the risk. "Any strangers come through recently, looking for someone?" The proprietor's single good eye narrowed slightly. "Couple Pinkerton men, week ago. Heading east, though." A calculated pause. "Why you asking?" "Owe a man money," Jack replied with a self-deprecating smile. "Rather not run into him before I've got it." The explanation seemed to satisfy the man, who merely grunted in response. Jack departed, sensing no immediate threat but remaining vigilant as he made his way back to where Swift Horse waited. Men inside the smaller building, the Ute informed him immediately. 3, armed, watching everyone who comes and goes. Jack processed this information quickly. "Bounty hunters or Pinkerton?" Swift Horse shook his head. "Not sure, but they watch with hungry eyes, like wolves seeing weak deer." They returned to Sarah and Maggie by a circuitous route, taking extra precautions to ensure they weren't followed. Jack's expression told Sarah everything she needed to know before he spoke. "Hayes has expanded the search beyond Wyoming," he concluded. "Pinkertons came through here heading east, but word of the reward has spread. $5,000 will have every opportunist watching for anyone matching your description." The journey through Navajo territory proved less challenging than Jack had feared. Swift Horse had advised them to approach openly and honestly, explaining that the Navajo respected directness while despising those who attempted to cross their land secretly. When they encountered a Navajo patrol on the second day, Jack followed this advice, stating clearly their purpose and destination. The warriors escorted them to meet with a respected elder named Standing Rock, who listened to their story with the same keen assessment Walking Fox had shown. "Many whites see only what they can take," Standing Rock observed after hearing their tale. "Land, gold, women, children, they understand ownership, not kinship." He studied Sarah and Maggie with penetrating intensity. "But I see truth here. Woman protects child not from her body. Man protects both without claiming ownership." The simple observation contained more understanding than they had received from most of civilized society. Standing Rock granted them passage through Navajo lands, even providing guides to ensure they reached the southern boundary safely. "Your enemy has great power in white man's world," the elder cautioned as they prepared to depart. "But power has limits. Distance weakens it. Time changes it. Remember this." The final leg of their journey proved arduous but uneventful. By early March, the winter's grip had begun to loosen slightly, making travel somewhat easier as they descended from the mountains into the more moderate climate of northern Arizona territory. On a clear afternoon, nearly 6 weeks after fleeing the cabin in Wyoming, they crested a ridge to see a sprawling valley spread before them. In the distance, a cluster of buildings surrounded by grazing land represented Prescott, the territorial capital, and nearby, James Thornton's ranch. "We made it," Sarah said softly, the simple statement weighted with the exhaustion and hope of their long journey. They approached the town via a circuitous route, skirting widely around the main roads to approach James Thornton's property from the less traveled western boundary. By dusk, they had reached a vantage point overlooking the ranch, a substantial spread with a main house, several outbuildings, and grazing land extending into the distance. Jack left Sarah and Maggie concealed near the creek while he advanced alone, alert for any sign of danger. The main house stood dark except for a single lamp burning in what appeared to be a study. He knocked firmly on the door, hand resting near his Colt. The door opened to reveal a tall man with features similar to Jack's, though with more gray in his beard. James Thornton stared at his younger brother for a long moment before recognition dawned. "Jack? Good God, man, is that you?" "Hello, James," Jack replied simply. Been a while. James pulled him into a brief embrace before stepping back. You look like you've ridden through hell itself. Elizabeth and the baby with you? Jack's expression tightened. Elizabeth passed last year. He met his brother's eyes directly. But there's much to explain, and I'm not alone. Understanding immediately that something significant was unfolding, James nodded once. Come in then, all of you. Jack retrieved Sarah and Maggie from their hiding place, bringing them to the warmth and safety of James Thornton's home. Inside, James's wife Margaret greeted them with practiced hospitality, immediately arranging food, hot coffee, and warm water for washing while asking no questions beyond immediate needs. Once Maggie had been fed and settled to sleep, Jack related their full story. James listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave as he absorbed the implications of Hayes's wealth, influence, and obsessive pursuit. $5,000, he finally said, shaking his head. That kind of money will tempt even honest men. Which is why we need more than just shelter, Jack acknowledged. We need legal protection, a way to end Hayes's pursuit permanently. James considered this, stroking his beard thoughtfully. I have some influence with Judge Holbrook, and the territorial governor owes me a favor after that business with the Prescott land grants. He glanced at Sarah. But it would help to have documentation, proof of Hayes's threats or mistreatment. Sarah shook her head regretfully. I fled with nothing but the clothes I wore. Everything remained in Denver under William's control. There might be another approach, Margaret suggested. The doctor who treated you during your pregnancy. Would he have records? Evidence of your confinement? Dr. Bennett, Sarah confirmed, hope flickering briefly in her eyes. He seemed uncomfortable with William's instructions, though he followed them. Perhaps if someone approached him directly. James nodded decisively. I have business contacts in Denver. Could send a telegram tomorrow. Have them make discreet inquiries. He turned to Jack. Meanwhile, you three stay here. Ranch hands are loyal, won't talk to strangers asking questions. For the first time since fleeing the cabin in Wyoming, Jack allowed himself to consider the possibility of genuine safety. His brother's ranch offered immediate security, while James's connections might provide longer-term protection through legal channels. That night, settled in a proper bedroom with Maggie sleeping peacefully nearby, Sarah finally gave voice to the exhaustion and relief that had been building throughout their journey. I never truly believed we'd make it, she admitted quietly, sitting on the edge of the bed. Some part of me expected William to win, as he always has before. Jack stood by the window watching the moonlit landscape beyond. He hasn't won yet, he cautioned, but we have allies now, and legal options that weren't available in Wyoming. Sarah nodded, acknowledging the reality of their situation. Hayes remained a threat, perhaps more dangerous now that conventional methods had failed him. Yet they had achieved what had seemed impossible weeks earlier, crossing hundreds of miles of wilderness in winter with an infant, evading bounty hunters and other dangers to reach a place of temporary sanctuary. Whatever comes next, she said softly, we face it together. You, me, and Maggie. Jack turned from the window, studying Sarah in the lamplight. The woman who had appeared at his door during a blizzard, desperate and frightened, had transformed through their shared journey. Still beautiful despite the hardships they had endured, but now carrying herself with a quiet confidence born of survival. Together, he agreed, the simple word containing a promise that transcended their current circumstances. Whatever the future held, whether Hayes was defeated through legal means or continued his vendetta indefinitely, they would face it as a family forged through shared struggle rather than conventional bonds. In that moment, with Maggie sleeping peacefully nearby, Jack Thornton allowed himself to envision possibilities beyond mere survival. A home built with their own hands. Maggie growing up strong and free, perhaps with siblings someday. Sarah practicing medicine as her father had wished, helping others while healing her own past wounds. A future worth fighting for, worth risking everything to protect. A second chance born from separate tragedies, proving that even in the harsh reality of the frontier, hope could take root and flourish against all odds. The journey ahead remained uncertain, the threat of Hayes still looming in the distance. But as Jack crossed the room to sit beside Sarah, taking her hand in wordless understanding, he knew with absolute certainty that they had already won the most important victory, the freedom to choose their own path forward, together. The next morning, James summoned Jack and Sarah to his study. On the table was a map of Arizona territory along with several legal documents. I've been thinking all night, James said, pointing to a spot on the map. There's a piece of land here about 40 miles west of Prescott, owned by me but undeveloped. Sits in a small valley with a creek and fertile soil. Far enough to not be easily found, Jack remarked, studying the location. Exactly, James nodded. That's the first part of the plan. I'll transfer that land to Sarah, but not under the name Colton or Hayes. Sarah looked at him with surprise. I don't understand. Margaret James's wife entered with a stack of papers. These are marriage and birth certificates. According to these documents, Sarah Parker and Jack Thornton were married in Virginia City, Nevada 2 years ago, and Margaret Thornton is their legitimate daughter. Forgeries, Jack said, understanding the plan. Judge Holbrook will authenticate them, James confirmed. He owes me a favor, and I believe he'll help once he hears your story. Legally, Sarah Hayes will cease to exist. What about William? Sarah asked, her voice serious. He won't stop because of some papers. That's the second part, James continued, producing a telegram. Last night I wired a business associate in Denver. He'll approach Dr. Bennett discreetly. Not to convince him to testify, that would be too dangerous, but to gather evidence. What evidence? Jack asked. Medical records, Margaret explained. The doctor's notes about Sarah's confinement. Hayes's instructions. All the things a man of reputation like William Hayes wouldn't want made public. James looked at Sarah, his expression resolute. We won't use this evidence to prosecute him. That would only lead him here. Instead, it will be insurance. A message will be sent to Hayes. If anything happens to Sarah Parker Thornton or anyone in her family, these records will be sent to every newspaper from San Francisco to New York, along with his business partners and political allies. Blackmail, Jack said, a rare smile crossing his face. I prefer to call it ensuring peace, James corrected, with a slight smile. A man like Hayes cares about power and reputation more than revenge. Threatening either is the best way to keep him at bay. The final part, Margaret said, concerns your future. James and I know a retired teacher in Prescott. She can help Sarah complete her medical training, turning what your father taught you into a proper profession. The Arizona Territory lacks doctors, especially those willing to care for women and children. Sarah looked at them, tears welling in her eyes. Why would you help us so much? James exchanged glances with his wife. Because family doesn't just come from blood. Sometimes it's created from the choices we make, the people we decide to protect. He looked at Jack. My brother has found his way back after years of being lost. That's not something money can buy. Jack nodded, gratitude evident in his eyes. So, James said, folding the map and handing the papers to Sarah. Welcome to the family, sister-in-law. We have work to do. Sarah held Maggie tightly, looking over the child's shoulder to meet Jack's gaze. For the first time since fleeing Denver, she felt real hope, not just day-to-day survival, but a future they could build together. A future that William Hayes, with all his money and power, could not take away.